We live in a post-Dark Souls world. A genre has been born from its influence, and more games of its ilk are released as time goes on. However, there is a subtle difference in approach some games are taking when it comes to using Dark Souls design. The obvious and more common way to carry on its methodology is to straight up make Dark Souls again, but with key refinements and personal taste changes. We can see this happening more frequently in current games, as naturally long development cycles have finally come full circle after the initial Dark Souls fervor. An extremely good example of this is the recently released Salt and Sanctuary. This is a game that has no qualms about showing off its influence directly, and once the novelty of 2D wears off, the general game flow feels unmistakably Dark Souls. That's not to say it's a carbon copy of Souls gameplay, but I feel right at home with its combat rhythms and aesthetic choices. There's also a huge amount of small design pieces present in this game that are directly from Dark Souls. All in all, Salt and Sanctuary feels constrained by its influence, and almost entirely defined by it as well, leaving little room for its own unique potential to shine. A game that leans a little farther away from Dark Souls' design, but still strays close to the path, is Dark Mouse. It shares less design elements in common with Dark Souls than Salt and Sanctuary does, but playing it a little makes it very clear where the combat and general enemy design came from. Some things, like heavily limited recovery options and fighting alongside ghosts of your previous attempts, make the game feel more fresh, but there is still a constant familiarity I feel while playing Dark Mouse. As a huge fan of Dark Souls 1 myself, I find games like this to be very enjoyable, but the thought comes up again and again. Haven't I already played Dark Souls? That doesn't mean iterative design doesn't have big benefits, because that can be seen directly in From Software's evolution while creating the Souls series. However, learning from and applying your influences in places less obvious is a method that has more potential to make something truly great, much like, I assume, the influences which resulted in the creation of the Souls series to begin with. Games obviously not born of the void, but which mix their elements in extremely fresh ways. In the same vein, Momodora Reverie Under the Moonlight is a game influenced rather strongly by the Souls series. But whereas games like Salt and Sanctuary use Dark Souls as a base and add some of their own elements, Momodora simply uses certain aspects of Dark Souls design that would improve what it already does. Like Dark Souls, it has animation-heavy combat, limited health recovery items, and a generally dark tone featuring plenty of corruption, lore, and NPC interaction. But more importantly, Momodora doesn't have a stamina system. There's only one highly polished weapon set you carry throughout the game that manages to allow for extremely varied combat. Stats and leveling have been completely removed in favor of secret health pickups and a few powerful and distinct active and passive items. Generally speaking, Dark Souls' influence can be seen if you know the series well, but Momodora doesn't become bogged down with unnecessary aspects of the Souls series as they pertain to its own goals. If you stripped every obvious piece of Dark Souls influence out of it, then you would still be left with a playable game. This approach, adapting rather than outright using design elements from Dark Souls, allows Momodora to feel almost as fresh as the Souls series did when they first released. Its game flow feels distinct, and while its setting and tone also have Dark Souls influences, it manages to bring a charm all its own, with very expressive and well-animated character interactions. One aspect I think is a much welcome improvement over the almost completely static communication present in the Souls games. And while Momodora will likely never reach the widespread acclaim that the Souls series has achieved, I think learning from its smart design decisions is just as important as the ones learned from the now revered masterpiece that is Dark Souls.